Hello Boogie Woogie lovers, and now is time for the third lesson on Pinetop Boogie, and today we're just going to jump straight into some ideas for improvisation, and I think that I'll just throw a whole load of different riffs and ideas at you and then see how you get on with that. It goes without saying that just playing one riff after the other is not going to sound very musical, but I think that we could spend a lot of time worrying about the theory, worrying about the blues, and you know, about how musical it is what we're playing. But at the end of the day, once you get some good riffs into your fingers, then you're in a position to start really playing this tune and having fun with it. And even within these little phrases, these are telling a little story. If you think about, we're in the key of E flat here, so our basic riff is, and we might have gone round that for a couple of 12 bar, couple of rounds of 12 bars, and then we want to basically improvisation, I suppose, started when people just got bored of playing the same thing, and so once you're getting into improvisation, then a lot of it boils down to what I've just played here, which is a kind of a cadence. Cadence, I think, comes from Latin. It means basically to fall, and so much of the music that we listen to is based on movements like this. So here we're going from a 5 chord to 1 chord, a 3 chord to a 1 chord, and that is reflected in the kind of riffs you can do. So for example, one of the most basic riffs you could do is simply play a 4 chord going to 1 chord in your right hand. So we're in E flat if we're in the first key that we're playing in the 12 bar blues, our 1 chord, and within that chord of E flat we can say that the 1 chord as well is also E flat, of course, and then there's also A flat, and that's really easy to remember because you're going to the 4 chord when you're moving up to the next part of the boogie. Think about the riff. So the very fact that you know the riff in now in the 4 chord of A flat means that you have some familiarity already with A flat if you didn't have already, and so you can use these A flat ideas, these 4 chord ideas here, to go back to the that doesn't sound right somehow, does it? But that's because it needs to resolve. And so it's just like any film or story. If there's no tension, then there can't be any release. So how would this actually work in terms of a riff? Well, here's your key, chord of A flat, your 4 chords, simple triad, and then you can just play the 5 of A flat below that. That also happens to be the 1 of the E flat, but let's not worry too much about theories and numbers for this session. But so you've already got the beginnings of, well, I suppose it's pretty decent improvisation in itself. It's blues. It doesn't need to be massively sophisticated. It shouldn't be pretentious. It should be a bit meat and potatoes. There's all sorts of ways that you can make it more sophisticated by bringing in kind of rhythmical ideas. So don't worry about anything seeming too basic to start off with, because there's going to be no limit of ways you can play around with it later as you become more and more comfortable with it. It's not limiting just because it's simple. In fact, very often the simplest ideas are are the best when it comes to blues and boogie. And so in this riff here, at the end, we've got a very fundamental idea that's going to be happening all the time in your improvisation, where you're resolving from your 4 chords to the 1 chord. Now this is E flat because you've got a 7 here, the 3 here, and the 1 here again. And in fact, you can use that chord a lot just by mucking around. But in this riff, we're coming from here, your 4 chords, and then just staying on that is not going to sound right in most situations. So you bring it back to that chord there, or that chord if you want. But we're taking a little journey. We're going the 4. You see, this is the 4th of the scale of E, flat dominant, 4, minor third, third. And this is something that happens in blues and jazz all the time, is it's called an enclosure. And I'm just, if you're using that dominant 7th in the bass, that gives it a really nice sort of bluesy feel. So if you can stretch to that, great. If you can't, just play the octave is going to sound just as good. Or maybe not quite as good, so you might want to put your dominant 7th at the top. So sometimes having smaller hands means that you think of things, of riffs that are even funkier than your fellow pianists who've got bigger hands and are focusing on trying to play as wide chords as they can all the time. So if you've got small hands that can only stretch to an octave or just jump to an octave even, don't worry, there's plenty of stuff for you to be getting great at. And so this enclosure of the 3rd, let's look at another riff. That's a very kind of Dr. John, New Orleans sound there, and it's just our enclosing of the 3rd, and of course I showed you it in the 4 chord. Don't be afraid of any of the keys, just learn your scale. Remember that you're flattening the 7th if you're playing blues, so this is A flat. And just the same thing, that's your 4th of A flat, minor 3rd and a 3rd. Don't be thrown by the fact that your minor 3rd is a white note and it's black notes in E flat. That's just silly. You know, they're just all equally as easy to play, and all this stuff about there's easy and hard keys, it's all put there in our minds, and it's a complete illusion. All the keys are easy if you work at them. So here we go. Now the nice thing about this riff is it brings in 2 ideas. One is the enclosure of the 3rd, but it also brings in the idea of rhythmical syncopation, which is absolutely fundamental to making a boogie woogie sound good. You can't just play. You can't play on the beat all the time unless there's a very specific musical point that you're making, and that's only going to work if the phrase you play after that is massively syncopated, probably. Now, what do we mean by syncopation? Syncopation means it's not always on the downbeat beats. So you got think about it. You got 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Okay, so downbeat is the 1, 2, 3, 4, and your upbeats are the ands. And so syncopation is basically stuff which is happening on the upbeat, on the ands, and it's going to make it sound great in this riff, because you've got the first one is coming off the beat, but the second one is on the beat. maybe they're actually both on the beat, but they're happening in different places in the bar. That's the point. And so that there's lots of different rhythms that you can start playing with. If I'm sure many of you are familiar with Latin music and rhythms, and so you can have something like the rumba clave. So you can use that sound like this with this chord here. Remember, this is the 9th E flat chord that we had in the last lesson here, and so you can recycle a lot of the stuff that you learnt in the first 2 lessons, and snatch the chords and use them here, there, and everywhere. So here. That's kind of a rumba clave, or you could do a son clave. So the only difference there is that the 3rd stab is happening a bit earlier. But I think it's not, at some stage you do need to really take it apart and work out, which part of the 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and are you playing your different chords against the left hand, so you can coordinate your left and right hand properly. But the main thing is to use your ear as to what sounds good to you, what feels funky to you. Okay. The other thing to emphasize is that regarding rhythm and syncopation is that we're not talking about straight beats here like you would have in Latin music, This is swinging, a swinging rhythm. And if you really want to break it down, and when you start trying to match these riffs right hands to left hands, you are going to have to start breaking it down a little bit. In fact, what's happening is that each of these beats is breaking more or less into a triplet. So it's more like 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a. So 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a. Now, whether it really is like that, I wouldn't want to put money on, but because when you hear the masters like Dr. John playing it with a proper swing, I'm sure it's not mathematically exactly a third, each of those breaking into 1 and a 2 and a, but it's near enough for us to work out how to get the more complex riffs in the right hand to fit in with the left hand. So if you're playing a something like this, so 1 and a 1 and a 1 and a, so you can see that there. So I think unless you've got really a lot of experience playing this kind of music before, then you're going to need to spend a few hours in the woodshed, so to speak, doing this sort of fairly painstaking practice. But it's fun, you're going to get a really good result, and actually the harder you work at it and the more you break it down, then the better it's going to sound. So how good is that? Okay, let's bring a few of these ideas that we've had already to create a musical phrase. This is what you need to start doing, is pulling these different things together, and I'll give you plenty of ideas in the next few minutes. But you need to be creating them yourselves, or listening to records like Dr. John's recordings of these, for example, and taking the bits that you like and creating your own phrases. It's no use just copying everything that's shown here or that is on a record. That's not going to sound right. So, but with these little ideas, you can start stringing them together, and you'll hear when they sound right. that's going to sound pretty good in terms of just a phrase in a boogie. And here what we got is we got our friend the enclosure of the third, but rather than happening in a chord, we're just hearing it on its own. It sounds really nice like that. And then that's going down the E flat triad. Remember, this is in the E flat, this one. So this is our friend the enclosure of the third again. Now we're starting to really play some of those kind of boogie phrases. Now, do you recognise that as the famous riff that we had in the last lesson? The famous lick. And so rather than starting at the top here on the one here of the E flat, you start on the 7th, and that's just a roll, you know. And that's actually pretty much the same as our original riff we had here. Okay, we've done a lot in the 1 chord. What about the 4 chord? Well, the 4 chord you're only going to have 2 bars on. You know, there's a lot of ideas that you'll hear quite frequently. Quite often it uses the 9th chord of A flat, so that's the counterpart of the E flat 9th chord. And I think part of the reason why that works is that in E flat you'll quite often be in that position there, and then it's easy to move to this position, and then it's easy to go from this then back to. And so the sort of things you can do. Nice and easy thirds within your scale of A flat dominant. Easy once you've practiced them and got them into your fingers. And then once you got that, then there's all sorts of lovely kind of rolls you can do with it. Okay, and again, simplicity. Now, if that sounds good on the 1 chord, it might sound good on the 4 chord as well. One of the reasons why blues is, to a certain extent, less complex than jazz is that you can use a lot of the scales and phrases that work on the 1 chord on the 4 chord as well. That's not going to sound right because you've got an avoid note here on the A flat. And then that note wants to resolve down here because that's the 4 of A flat to the 3rd of A flat, all right? So you do need a little bit of theory will help you understand why things which you play in E flat don't work in A flat. But a lot of these things will work very well in both E flat, A flat, and indeed your 5 chord. Okay, so we're getting a bit more into sort of quite traditional blues riffs. One point to make here is that this sounds very much like a sort of guitar riff. And so you don't find these long sort of snaking single note lines that you might find in jazz. not going to find all that kind of stuff going on very much in boogie woogie. It's going to be quite a lot of sort of chords or sort of interval type chords and riffs and things which make sense on their own without needing to have a big long phrase to sort of tell a beginning and a middle and an end. A lot of these phrases are kind of quite standalone, but linking them all together in a really good solo, that's something else. But there's a lot of things you can play around with that will work in your one chord that you only have to modify a little bit in your four chord. And I think it's worth spending quite a lot of time, if you're not familiar with the blues, just playing more simplified left hand and getting used to some of these blues phrases. Whoops. Okay. So here, with these kind of phrases, a very useful scale to know is the blues scale. In E flat, we're lucky because it's all black notes. That's a minor pentatonic actually, and all you do is you put in the flattened fifth of E flat, and that's also going to work. You see, that works pretty well. You see, that works pretty well in all the keys. That's the principle that I was talking about there. And so the just going up and down the blues scale on its own is going to sound a bit naff after a while. But there, you've already got other tools at your disposal, like your enclosing the third if you're an E flat. Okay, and so how would that work in a boogie? I suppose with a boogie you need to work out a lot more how it's going to fit in with this pattern or whatever left hand pattern you're going to play in the left hand, and so that takes a bit of coordination, as I said. Okay, let's see. I think that we kind of got sidetracked here from our friend the four chord because I only gave you a couple of ideas there. Another one is, and this will work in actually any of the keys, is to use the riff. These are 6 intervals, remember, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so you could go. That's slightly different from the riff. You're just making a slightly different musical statement there. And the phrase sort of ends nicely. And again, we got this minor thirds to the third, so you got these same little things happening, cropping up again and again. And here's another one, quite a nice one in the four chords, is that you might want to make your way further up the keyboard so that then when you go back to the one chord, you can come back down again with a riff. And this is something that you hear quite a lot. Except that it's usually played something like this. So the blues will use a lot of these crush notes, and it is, I'm afraid, just a matter of really practicing these until they become really comfortable in your fingers. But once you do that, then they sound great. Or you can kind of syncopate it a bit. So at the end of your phrase on the 4 chord, you've got to come back into the 1 chord. So it's about timing that our friend the enclosure to the 3rd, so that it's going to come more, you know, pretty much on the first beat when you get back into your 1 chord. So can you see there? I also used 2 approach notes up to the 3rd. I mean, that's a very common thing that you find that you need to use in jazz, is that you need to quite often find yourself on the chord tones. By chord tones I mean for an E flat, a 1, 3 and a 5. You need to find them, get on them on your downbeats. I don't think it's completely written in stone in either jazz or blues, but certainly you need to try and get there pretty much at the right time. And sometimes you need an extra note to make it work right. And this is the famous riff. Okay. And with a famous riff, you could spend forever just doing all the infinite variations of it. Or in the 4 chord. Okay, so that was a kind of a variation on the famous lick, but in the 4 chord, but with a lot of 6ths thrown in. There we go. We just used the main riff. We did a similar idea to that in the 4 chord just a little bit earlier. It's going to sound good in the 1 chord as well. So again, you know, think laterally. I mentioned this in the last video. You need to think laterally between different songs and different bits of music that you know that are going to work here, and also what you learn here can work and help you in your other tunes if it's right, if it's going to work for that tune. But you also need to think laterally within this tune and think about, well, what worked in the A flat. Might sound nice repeated in the 1 chord. It's not always going to sound good. You need to use your judgment. A couple of other quick things to mention is that you can use thirds a lot. Okay, and also fourths work well. Maybe not overdo them, but just you can get some really nice sort of riffs out of it. You see, I'm not really doing anything massively imaginative or spectacular going up and down the keyboard, but it sounds right for the tune. As long as there's a bit of excitement somewhere, then I think that quite often you can get away with some pretty basic phrases, and that is going to be what's best, what works for this boogie. Also want to mention your flattened 10th chord. So this is a flattened 10th because there we go, that's the 9th chord. Well, if that's the 9th of E flat, that's 10th, that's a flattened 10th. It's a kind of, you know, Jimi Hendrix, Purple Haze sort of sound, and it works really well as long as it's not overused. And then if you just slip everything down chromatically, you end up with a 13th here in A flat. It's a very useful chord to know about. Sounds particularly nice if you put the one on the top here. And so you can make a whole solo out of that chord. Okay, trills, that's another thing that you should think about. Between that 3 and the 7th is incredibly common in blues. If your technique is up to it. And we haven't mentioned the 5 chord. Let's just end with a couple of nice riffs for the 5 chord at B flat. I mean, in the actual main riff, you're only spending 1 bar on B flat, and then you're going down to the 4 chord A flat. But sometimes it's nice to stay on there for 2 bars, as long as you're not going to mess with the head of a bass player or anything like that. That's just our enclosed third, but in B flat, alright? And that actually looks quite like the riff in A flat. So you could either stay in B flat under that, or you could go to A flat. They both sound fine. And then you do need to sort of end the phrase showing that you're back on a 1 chord, and you can feel that it's back on a 1 chord. And this is a very common way of ending it, getting back. And so that, in fact, from the point of view of E flat, is going to be the minor 3rd and the 6th, going to the 3rd and to the 1st. And that's such a common thing. So here you can hear that it sounds good, and then you want a turnaround maybe. So I'll just show you a very quick turnaround. But more on turnarounds and other things like that in the next lesson. So good luck with everything. I hope that's useful, and until next time.